Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this EMB Third Thursday Science webinar. I'm Paula Kellett. I'm a Science Officer at the European Marine Board, and I will be moderating today's session. So let's get going. So just some housekeeping rules before we get going. Please make sure your name is clearly entered. So if you do ask questions, we know who you are. While asking questions during the discussion part, or even, you can submit them during the presentation itself, please use the Q&A option that should be at the bottom of your screen. And ideally, if you can let us know which organization and country you're from, then we know sort of the context of the question as well. And then I will pose the questions to our speaker. If you need any technical support during the session, then please use the chat function, because that is only available to us, so the other participants won't see that. And please note that this webinar is being recorded and it will be live streamed on YouTube and made available there for rewatching in future as well, so act accordingly. So today's session is on the why, the what, and the how of interdisciplinary endeavour. And this talk is actually linked to our position paper, which is still in work. So it's Navigating the Future 6, which is one of our foresight series, looking at where marine science and policy is going next. And this publication is actually still in work. So the presentation you'll see today is sort of a sneak peek of one of the topics that we're discussing in that document, which will be published later this year. And to give this talk, we have, I'm very excited, Nicola Beaumont, who is honorary professor at the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of East Anglia, and also linked to the University of Exeter. She is the lead of Sea and Society at Plymouth Marine Laboratory in the UK, and obviously as a co-author of Navigating the Six document, specifically in the Ocean and People chapter. So I will give the floor to her, and we can get going with the presentation. Over to you.
Thanks, Paula. That's brilliant. I'll just share my screen. Can you see that okay?
Yep, that's perfect. Thank you.
Brilliant. That's great. So thank you for the introduction, Paula. Yeah, I'm Nicola Beaumont, and I'm based at the Plymouth Marine Laboratory in the UK. And my background is interdisciplinary, which is a lot to do with why I'm here giving this talk to you today. When I finished my original degree in marine biology, I immediately felt really frustrated by the fact I could see a lot of marine science being undertaken, but not a lot of action happening with regard to policy and management. And so at that point, at the age of 21, I retrained in economics, and I did a PhD in environmental economics, bringing in also marine elements. And for the last 27 years, because that's how long I've been working now in this area, I've been bridging disciplines. And for the first 10 years, it was really just about the economics and the marine science. But then more recently, I've been bringing in pretty much every discipline you can think of. So I lead the Sea and Society team at PML. And here we are 12 researchers and 7 PhD students and a project manager. So there's 20 of us. And we cover the disciplines of economics, of psychology, of social sciences, and we also have ecologists in the team as well. So really bringing lots of people together. And I've led a whole range of other projects and been involved in lots of other projects as well, which have brought in pretty much every discipline, it feels like, that you can think of. So I've worked with artists, I've worked with archaeologists, I've worked with literature experts, and I really enjoy that. I think, it's a really interesting space to work in. And I just want to use today to share with you some of the experiences that I've had, and also some of the voices from the people that I've worked with. So the presentation today is given by me, but it's actually driven by contributions from a whole range of different people. The names of some of these are here on this first slide, but actually there's lots more people as well who contributed to the content of this presentation. And the Wordle that you can see here is really nice, because this is a Wordle that we produced canvassing over 100 people about what their thoughts about interdisciplinary working were. And these were the keywords that came up. The size of the word is linked to how often it came up. So The first question is why. I think it's really important always to ask ourselves, why do we need interdisciplinary working? And I think it's fair to say that we are in unprecedented times. The societal change, environmental change, economic change that we're undergoing at the minute is remarkable, actually. And we need to take transformative approaches if we're going to address these issues. Just looking at climate change and trying to achieve net zero, we can't address this issue just by taking one discipline, for example, ecology, or another one such as psychology, and working on our own. We need to move away from these siloed approaches and work together. Other issues are obviously things like marine plastic pollution, climate, coastal erosion and flooding, and the warming of the oceans. This is showing you some dead coral and also ocean acidification. And I think these challenges that we face now are so huge that we need to go a different route than we have previously. Working in single disciplines has shown over time that we're just on the wrong trajectory. We're on a trajectory towards environmental damage and societal degradation. So this is, I think, really why we need to take a different approach to how we work, and bringing in all the different disciplines to do this. So then, hopefully that's convinced you about the why, but we can obviously, there's questions at the end, so we can talk about that a little bit more. The next thing is what is it? And I think this has been fascinating over the last 10 or 15 years, is watching this word interdisciplinarity and interdisciplinary be used by lots of different people in lots of different ways. And it can be quite confusing sometimes about what's meant by this. So I think it is worth taking a minute to think about what we actually mean here. And I find this spectrum approach is quite helpful. So we start here at the left-hand side with intradisciplinary, which is just working in one discipline, moving into cross-disciplinary, where we have the different disciplines together, perhaps in a project, but we sort of watch each other. We don't really interact particularly well or rely on each other's outputs. We're just sort of aware of what each other are doing. Through to multidisciplinary, which is where you're working together a little bit more closely. So what it might mean is that you hand an output of your research over to somebody else at the end when you finish working, but not really changing your own working practice to address other disciplines. Then through to interdisciplinary, and now we're really starting to integrate our knowledge. So we might actually start to shift some of our methods or change some of our working practices to accommodate the other disciplines. And then finally, transdisciplinarity at the end, where we have this unity of intellectual frameworks. And it just would take a moment to go into these in a little bit more detail, because I think it is really important that we understand these different terms so that we don't have confusion when we're talking about these. Interdisciplinary working is really confusing in terms of terminology anyway. So if even the words we're using to describe the interdisciplinary working aren't clear, then that's not a good place to start. And I like to use, when I'm talking about this, food, because I like food, and I think it's something we're all familiar with, and it's quite a useful concept, I think. So in the case of intradisciplinarity, I use the example of an apple. So it's just completely straightforward. It's one discipline, one discipline, and either an individual or a group of people working within that single discipline. For cross-disciplinarity, the example that I have here is I think quite a British thing, and this is where we have cheese and pineapple, and this is a British thing we have at parties, where you put a cube of cheese and a cube of pineapple together on a stick, and they're next to each other, but they don't actually, you don't mix them in any way. They just sit beside one another in the idea that they will complement each other, but without actually needing to integrate in any significant way. And this is where, like I said, where you're working in your discipline in a project, perhaps with other people working in their disciplines, and you're aware of what they're doing, but you don't really engage in any deep way. And the third example, moving along the spectrum is multidisciplinarity. So then we're starting to come together a little bit more closely and working more simultaneously or in very close succession. We're starting to be a bit dependent perhaps on each other's outputs. So you might be waiting for the ecologists to do their field work before you can then progress your modelling, or you might be waiting for the output of the model before you can go and do your surveys. And the food example I have here for this is hummus and carrots. So you're actually starting to mix the two foods together a little bit more. Then moving on to interdisciplinarity. And now we're really starting to mix these things together. So we're actually changing our approaches. We might be starting to think about our own discipline quite differently based on the conversations we have with others. And the coleslaw example is that you can still clearly see the different disciplines. So in there, you can see that you've still got maths, and you've still got perhaps geography, and you've perhaps got psychology. You can see the disciplines quite separately, but they really are starting to mix up together. And then finally is we have the transdisciplinarity. And the example that I have here is a chocolate cake. And in this case, you have got your component parts, you have your butter and your flour. But in this case, they're mixed together. And actually what comes out of it is something that looks completely different to those individual component parts. And often it's thought that when you achieve this transdisciplinarity position, that you almost generate a new discipline in its own right, and you have an outcome that's really quite indistinguishable from those original parts. So I think this is very rare, and I think most often we may say in proposals that we're aiming for this, but actually it's really hard to get to. And if we just go back and look at that spectrum again, and like moving around that circle, I think that there's a couple of points that are important to keep in mind. One is that there is no right place to be on this. I don't think that achieving the transdisciplinarity is some nirvana that we should all be aiming for. In some projects, it's ideal to be cross-disciplinary. In some projects, we definitely still need to be single discipline. Where we are on the spectrum should be driven not by some ideological desire to be as integrated as possible. It should be driven by what we're trying to achieve in the project. And I think that if you want to simplify things, we could just take the word interdisciplinary, and I tend to do this in this presentation. I tend to take the word interdisciplinary to cover this whole spectrum and really think about it as projects which are integrating academics and researchers and stakeholders together to reach a common goal. So in this presentation and in a lot of work that I do, I use that word interdisciplinary as a bit of a catch-all for all these things. Another important point before I move on from this is the word transdisciplinary is one of the really interesting ones, because this is used differently in some cases. So I have seen this increasingly used to describe an interaction between stakeholders or non-academics and academics. I personally find that definition difficult when I'm talking about disciplines. These little circles that we can see in the PowerPoint here, I include non-users and I include users and non-academics as one of these circles. They're a discipline in their own right. So you can have projects that are cross-disciplinary, including non-academics and stakeholders. You can have projects that are interdisciplinary, including non-academics and stakeholders. I think using the word transdisciplinary to define where you have a mix of academics and stakeholders in one project, I find that really unhelpful, but I do recognize that's increasingly coming up. So it's something really for you to be aware of, that sometimes that word transdisciplinarity is used in that way. So some of the positive and negatives, we surveyed 117 people about what they thought were the positives and negatives of interdisciplinary working. And these charts just show you some of the positives. So it's really interesting and stimulating. And I think this is really why I love it. It's able to identify the problem more effectively and actually come up with far better solutions. I really like the fact that fun was in here, and a lot of people just thought it was fun. And again, I think that's probably one of the drivers for my own engagement. One is that it engages non-academics and external stakeholders and the general public much more effectively. It opens up funding, and another is that it opens up funding avenues. And there's a little quote here at the bottom from one of the team. There's also negatives, and I'll talk more about these negatives and how we can address these negatives as I move through the slides. It's time consuming. It dilutes disciplinary research. And this is really interesting, I think, because one thing that shouldn't happen but can happen is when you're doing interdisciplinary work, the quality of the disciplinary work can drop. So you end up with slightly less excellence in that individual discipline. I don't think that has to happen, and I think it should be avoided, but it can, if you're not careful, be the case. It's hard to publish in high impact journals. It's frustrating and it's confusing. It's not respected in that people think if you're doing interdisciplinary work that it's a bit of everything, and not really excellent, as I'd said earlier. And it can be really hard to select which disciplines to work with. So some of the positives and negatives when we discuss this. And also barriers and solutions we investigated. And I'll share these together because the barriers and the solutions are linked. One of the key barriers that came up again and again was inadequate communication. This is a real problem when we're working in an interdisciplinary world. Poor understanding of the other is another barrier, which obviously can be a solution for that is if we can improve that. A third barrier is that we don't have much time or facilitation for this. Often we plan a project and we just don't include any additional time if it's interdisciplinary. But of course, everything is going to take longer because we're speaking different languages. The fourth here is that narrow academic training. I mean, it's very much in the UK that you're expected to focus on a discipline even as early as being 16. In fact, we even encourage in the UK educational system to focus ourselves to sort of science or languages as early as 13. So we have this very narrow approach, I think, in our academic training towards disciplinary working. There's funding constraints. It can impede your career progression. And currently, when we think about success, interdisciplinary working is often not included in those criteria. So what I'll do now is we'll give a bit of thought about how we can address some of these barriers and solutions, and hopefully give you some useful tools for the toolbox of how we can actually work in an interdisciplinary way more effectively. Before I move on to that, I really like this little cartoon, and this is with reference particularly to the funding of interdisciplinary working. There's a few issues with funding interdisciplinary working, and I see these actually across the globe. I do a lot of reviewing and working with a range of funding bodies internationally, and there's two things. One is that funders really struggle to fund something that's innovative because they want standard approaches that they're familiar with because they're safe. And that's really what this cartoon is saying about here. And the quote is another issue, which is that something I see repeatedly on review panels is we'll have an interdisciplinary project. It will be reviewed by people who are experts in one discipline, and they'll pull the project apart based on one tiny bit of their disciplinary understanding, completely missing the point of the wider project. So there's a real problem with the peer review and how we approach this, and you know, things to be addressed, I think, moving forward. So onto the how and the, you know, top tips of how we can do this better. There's 7 principles that we put together of how we can do a better job of interdisciplinary working moving forward. The first one is one that I come across again and again, and I would ask you now to just take a moment and just think for a second, have you ever looked at somebody else's discipline or someone else's topic and thought, oh gosh, that's really hard. Like, that's really hard. I just don't think I could do that. Like, for me, that's when I think about physics, I'm like, I could never do that. Like, it's really, really hard. Now take a moment, and instead of thinking about it in that direction, think for a second for me about, have you ever looked at somebody else's discipline or topic area and thought, gosh, that's actually quite easy. I think probably that's quite a lot easier than what I do. And in honesty, I've also, I think, done that. And that is enormously disrespectful. So as soon as we start to prejudge someone else's work and someone else's discipline as somehow simpler or easier, or even the other direction of thinking it's so much harder, we just have to be honest with ourselves. We don't know, do we? We don't know how hard someone else's job is. And actually, you can never judge. And that issue of respecting each other and respecting each other's work is so important. The cartoon here makes light of it. And I think there is this kind of idea that somehow physicists and mathematicians are really, really hard, and then it's somehow easier down towards the softer sciences. And this whole prejudgment can completely undermine any interdisciplinary working. It is really damaging to having successful interdisciplinary working. So some top tips on respect. Firstly, keep an open mind. Really listen to other people. Don't think you know what they're talking about unless you're really confident, and ask questions. Avoid having preconceptions, assumptions, and patronization. I've been in interdisciplinary groups where one of the people in one of the disciplines might have read something in a newspaper about one of the other disciplines, or perhaps a short article, or even a light, accessible book. And they come in with their opinions and their strong ideas about what the other person is doing and how they could do it in a better way, just from having read a very small amount, whereas the person, the expert, might have worked in that area for 20 years. So I think it's really important to consider our own behavior, but also those the behavior of those around us, and really kind of avoid these things. What I have done in a number of projects is started out by developing project guidelines to make sure that we're respecting each other and that each discipline is given equality within the project. And make sure in the project that you acknowledge and demonstrate appreciation for everybody in achieving the goals. So everybody's putting in, everybody's working, and they should all be given appreciation for that. A final thing here is it can be really nice to undertake an activity together, particularly a publication. So if you're starting a big project, to do a review publication together where you bring all the different disciplines into one place, and having that immediate shared goal can be really, really positive. So that's the first one. The second thing I think that's really important is that we take time. One thing I see repeatedly in interdisciplinary projects is they try and achieve the same as if they just had lots of single disciplines, and they don't factor in time for that interdisciplinary working. They don't factor in, for example, a few days to sit down and learn each other's languages. They don't factor in the fact that every conversation you have is probably going to take twice as long or 3 times as long, because you're talking different languages and coming at these things from different places. So I think there was a really strong need that we actually do take that time to listen to each other. And this is a comment that came from one of the projects that I was leading, actually, that it was a pity that we were so disparate and that we didn't have time to get under each other's skin. And this was a few years ago, and I really took that on board. And now I really make sure that I factor in time when I'm designing projects moving forward. So some of those top tips on how to do this good interdisciplinary working. One, like I'm saying, is to actually build that additional time into your project timelines, factor in these activities. Meetings take much longer. Like, it's really interesting how much longer you can take over having a discussion. Partly, I found, because people are actually interested in each other's disciplines. So, for example, if you have an economist and an artist in a meeting together, a lot of academics are just really interested to learn more about each other and each other's work and each other's disciplines, and what you don't want stations to run. So factoring that extra time into meetings is really helpful. And actually budgeting for this is really key. So when you're planning your project at the proposal stage, put money in for this, put resource in for this, to make sure that you've actually got activities and time that there is actually money to spend on this activity. So the third aspect is communication, and this is always a huge issue. So something like the word function is fascinating to me. I think every discipline uses the word function in a completely different way, and I have seen hours lost to people having discussions around the word function, meaning absolutely opposing things. So different disciplines, really, we have the same words, but they have completely different meanings. And a few of the top tips here are, early on in a project, it can be good to develop a glossary or a project specific dictionary where you can all put in words and what they mean, and then you can have not agreed understandings of words, because you don't want you don't want everybody to have the same understanding of the word function, but to be clear that we have different understandings of the word function. You need to maintain that the different meanings of the word, but you need to be clear that that word has those different meanings. Don't be afraid to admit you don't understand, is absolutely critical. One task that I've used before is to get each other to listen to each other and then repeat each other's work back to the other. And in fact, one thing that I did in a project that worked really well is I got the participants to present each other's work. So the economist would present for the artist and the psychologist would present for the ecologist, and they would share their work and present it, because actually when you try and do that, it was very entertaining. But also it really pushes you to think, do I understand? Have I properly understood that? And that was a fun exercise and very interesting. Another like practical activity that we did is we went to a field site, and this is some of my colleagues on a very wet British day on a salt marsh. And we looked out across the salt marsh, and each of us took it in time to explain what we saw. So the ecologist obviously saw something very different to, for example, the economist, and the economist saw something very different to the psychologist, and the manager of the site saw something very different again. And just each taking a turn to say what they saw was really, really interesting. And this final point, I think sometimes people overcomplicate the language that they use as a defense mechanism towards their discipline. And I think it's really key to remember that you can be simple in your communication. That doesn't mean that your discipline is simple. It means that you're good at communicating well. And working on how you can explain complex issues to non-experts is a real skill, and actually something that's worth taking time to develop. And this was a really nice output of that salt marsh project that we did together as a team as well regarding communication. We used an artist to help us draw out a salt marsh, and we did it as a team, so all the different disciplines were involved. And it helped us all understand, this is a salt marsh at high tide and at low tide. It helped us all understand, like I was saying before, what we were seeing in that environment. And I think bringing in this sort of artistic approach to this was really helpful. The fourth thing is about embracing personalities. And for me, this is really interesting because I've met people before now who say, oh, I could never work with a musician. I just couldn't, because I just can't get along with them. And I mean, that's crazy, because actually, of course, there's more than one musician, and one musician doesn't encompass all musicians. Same with ecologists, they're all different. And perhaps you've had a not great experience with one person from one discipline, but I don't think we can write off the whole discipline based on that. The thing that I've seen very clearly is that when you have two people who get along well, that interdisciplinary working goes up a whole nother level. So it's not just about bringing disciplines together, it's about bringing people together and ensuring that people, or encouraging those really good interpersonal relationships between people. Once you have that, all of a sudden your ability to work together and do something really exciting and new is quite different. But I think we have to accept that there are different personalities at stake here. So a couple of top tips around this. It's really helpful if in a project or a work environment, you can get to know each other a little bit outside your usual workplace. One thing we've done to do this is we've had STEM events. So these are science events that we have with the general public. So where we share our science with the general public, with school children, and take people out of their normal working space somewhere else. To have a shared experience together. That can be really good for getting teams to know each other and get along well. And this point here, like I said earlier, remember that if you just meet one person that you don't particularly get along with from one discipline, that doesn't mean that the whole discipline can be written off. It can take you time to find the right people to work with. And this is just some images of us being out and about doing ridiculous amounts of public engagement and school children work together. You can't help but get along with each other when you've been doing these kind of things. The fifth aspect is about preparation. If we're going to be working together, it can be quite unfamiliar for people. So really taking time at the beginning of a collaboration to determine if you need an interdisciplinary approach. Like I said earlier, how interdisciplinary do you want it to be? Where on that spectrum do you want it to be? Who do you want to bring in? Which disciplines? At the beginning, really ensuring that roles and responsibilities are clear is really critical. And having an agreed publication strategy is helpful because different disciplines publish in really different ways. So taking time at the start to prepare for this is really, really key. The sixth part is around adaptation. I find that in all projects that I work on, single discipline or multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, things happen, don't they? Things always happen on projects. Things go wrong, things go right, things go differently. And you have to adapt during the project to take this on board. And I think I see in interdisciplinary working, it's much more unpredictable. And this adaptability, this ability to shift and think, oh, okay, we had planned that the ecologist would deliver that and the psychologist would produce a survey that did this. But actually now that's not going to work because the timelines don't work or the field data is not what we expected or something happens. And there is a really strong need for adaptation, I think, in interdisciplinary projects. So a few top tips around this. It's really helpful to have a Gantt chart that you come to regularly and you look at, and actually if it's not going to work, then you are really proactive and you change direction if you need to. Don't just keep going along the same route if it's not going to work. Make sure that you have a really good risk management strategy when you're writing your proposal that takes into account the fact that things might not always go to plan. And really maintain, like, again, we're coming back to communication and get people to talk if they're worried or have concerns. It is hard, I think, this interdisciplinary working, especially when you're expecting outputs from somebody and they come and they're different to what you thought, or a whole range of different things can come up. So that communication is really key. And the final point is around sharing. And I think that interdisciplinary working is really hard. Like it is really tough. And I think one of the things that I haven't seen enough on and I'd like to see more of is how we share our experience and talk about what went well and what didn't go well. And some of the top tips here are that it's useful if you can talk with other people who are working in this context. A thing that I've done on all my projects is I've kept a diary of things that have gone well and then things that have not gone well. And then I can sort of build on that and sort of make sure I'm always learning. There's a lot of literature out there on interdisciplinary working. So I'm here speaking to you today, but there's a whole host of other resources that are available. And actually, they can be really interesting to read. And actually writing up and sharing your own interdisciplinary experiences, I think, is really key as well. One of the approaches that we use to share our work that I just wanted to share with you, because it's one of my favorite things that I've done, is we had an art exhibition at the end of one of my large projects where everybody, and there was all sorts of people on this project. There was economists and psychologists and ecologists on this project, and geographers and social scientists, and an artist was on the project. And all of the different disciplines produced a exhibition piece about their work. So everybody had to put their research into an artistic format. And we had an event in London, and it was just brilliant, actually, because it made the work really accessible. And it was a really nice way to share the interdisciplinary work that we've been doing. So really wrapping up now, I really like this cartoon because it shows that actually if we work individually when we're assessing a big problem, that we'll all come up with different answers, all of which will probably be wrong. It's only by working together that we can really probably understand what's going on here. And then my final slide, just to reference, a lot of the things that I've shared in this presentation today come from this document, which can be accessed online. The 7 principles of interdisciplinary working with the top tips are here as well. So you can access that. And also I love talking about this stuff, and I'm really always excited to share and listen and hear other people's experiences. So I'm always available to discuss this. And that was all I had in the way of the presentation. Paula, I think then we're on to the discussion, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating and really useful. I think it's great to have those practical tips and ideas as well. And I'm sure we'll dig into those in a bit more in a minute. So as Britt has said in the chat, if you have any questions for Nicola, please do put those in the Q&A and we'll pose them to her. While you're thinking about that, I'll start linking to the beginning of your presentation and go through, because I do have a couple of questions. So my first one was, you were talking about how there is this sort of diversity of understanding of the terms around interdisciplinary and so on. And how much of an issue do you think it is that we haven't got an agreement? Is that something we should be striving for, or is it, again, just an understanding that there is a difference?
It's quite important that we have an agreement, if I'm honest. I think it's really hard to get to that, but I think the problem that we have is, for example, people will write the call for a research program, and in there they might say we need transdisciplinary working. Now, if that isn't clear what they mean by that, then are they meaning that we need that chocolate cake, or are they meaning that we just need to bring in some stakeholders? And they're very different things, aren't they? And so I do think it's important that perhaps not that we have unity in how we use it and how the definitions are, but perhaps that there's clarity, so that if in that proposal call there is the word transdisciplinarity, that they then say, and what we mean by this is, because it's important, and I think it's different. So in an ideal world, yeah, we'd all use the words in the same way. It's not an ideal world. So I think if we're going to use the words, we should clearly define what we mean by them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Great. So we have one question from one of our attendees. I don't know who, it's anonymous, but they say, I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on how interdisciplinary careers could be better recognized and rewarded. Do you have some ideas?
Yeah, so this is really huge. And I work with a lot of early career researchers at the moment. And there's a real hesitation, I think, from them to get involved in interdisciplinary working, because they worry that they won't be recognized, because there's problems in getting jobs for starters, because if you are half economist and half biologist, most jobs are for an economist or a biologist. They're not for that. And particularly, for example, universities will offer lectureships in biology or in economics. They don't often offer these interdisciplinary roles. So it's really challenging. And there's also a challenge around publishing. Often a lot of the high impact publications and journals are single discipline. I think what I encourage the early career researchers to do is to originally focus really on one discipline. I think that's not a bad thing, to have a core discipline that they define themselves as. I think early in your career, that's really important. Then you've got that disciplinary grounding. And then moving forward, I think you have the freedom then, once you've got that grounding, to bring in other disciplines. But I do think we need some people that can speak lots of different languages, but it is a risky career path. And it's not probably necessarily what people want to hear, but it is a risky career path, because if you are too diverse, you're in too many disciplines, you can end up without that individual skill. So I think what I would encourage an early career researcher to do is to get that in-depth early understanding of a discipline, that they have then that deep grounding, and then reach out to other disciplines as well. What we need to do as well is look for ways to reward that interdisciplinary approach more effectively. And I think that's coming, because I think there's more and more acknowledgement that we can't tackle those really tricky issues if we don't have that.
Yeah.
Sorry, there's not an easy answer. I'd love to say.
There never is there?
No.
And kind of linked to that, is there a clear way, if you did want to take this step towards interdisciplinary working, and I think one of the questions in the Q&A reflects this as well, kind of, are there obvious steps? How do you start looking for these collaborations, and how do you get going?
This is what a lot of people ask, is like, how do I find a psychologist? Like, I want to do this, but how do I go about finding? I think it's really tricky. I think a good place to start is at conferences and networks, and there are increasingly networks that do bring together different disciplines. And like I've sort of alluded to in the presentation, a lot of this is around personalities. So it's about getting yourself out, and thankfully now post-COVID we can get ourselves out. So getting yourself out to conferences and hopefully going and chatting to people, talk to people who do psychology, talk to people who do art, try and strike up conversations, because because this interdisciplinary work is hard, if you're going to have a really enriching relationship with somebody, you need to get along with them as well. So I think that's a huge thing. It's just physically getting yourself out in meetings and talking to people with different disciplines and saying, hey, I'm really interested in that. And can you think of any link to this? It's useful if you've got a topic. So if you're, for example, researching marine plastic pollution and you're thinking, I'd really like, and I'm an ecologist and I'd like to work with a psychologist, again, like look through publications perhaps that have done surveys and contact that person and say, look, I'm really interested in what you do. Perhaps you could find, like, you know, we could think about working together. I think it falls apart if you think I want to work with psychology. I think you need to look for those people and look for those individual connections, but it's tough. That's a really regular question and it's really tough to do.
Yeah, indeed. And I kind of related to that. So in the chat, Imali, who is a PhD student from the University of Southampton, they ask, how challenging is it to carry out an interdisciplinary project for a PhD project where the majority of the work has to be handled by the PhD student on their own? What's reasonable?
This is really hard. And actually, this is a conversation I've been having a lot lately with so the UK Research Institute about PhD students, because they have been driving for interdisciplinary PhD students. And I have seen PhD students come through who they're trying to do, they'll have a degree in marine biology and they'll be trying to do marine biology, obviously still, but economics and then some complex oceanography modeling. And you're one human being and you're trying to do all of these things. It's really hard. And I think the thing that I would encourage any PhD student to do, and I know it's really difficult when you've got your supervisors, but like try and focus particularly on one discipline. So maybe make the majority of your PhD around one discipline and then bring in a little bit of the other disciplines, rather than thinking I'll do 50% biology, 50% economics. Like it's too much for one human being, I think, personally. But I know other people disagree, but I think at the PhD level, you're better to, learn about those other disciplines. So absolutely, if you're doing ecology, then do a small survey of people perhaps, or perhaps do a little bit of oceanographic modeling. Really, really great in your PhD if you can learn that. But be wary of, just spreading yourself too thinly. It's just really, really tough for the students coming through. It's something I've been working on a lot lately, like I say. Yeah.
Just doing a PhD is tough enough. Never mind that as well.
It's really hard.
So then Rebecca, who's also a PhD student, she's saying her thesis is all about interdisciplinary practice, but specifically focusing on the use of creative methods and art-based techniques to facilitate or disturb interdisciplinary working. She says you touched on the art exhibitions at the end of one of your projects, but as part of the day-to-day interdisciplinary working, have you used creative methods to support the projects, and what techniques did you use to shape the space and inform perspectives?
Oh, so this was so interesting. I had such a steep learning curve on this. So I had an artist on one of my projects and I got it so wrong. I'll share with you because I think that's important. I got it really wrong because I'm a scientist by training, don't know very much about art. And this was quite a few years ago. And I didn't really understand what he was bringing and I didn't get his process. And I asked him to do the logo for the project, because he was really cross, which was reasonable because we had quite an interesting start to the project. So he explained, and it's really fascinating you use those words. He explained that his value was to be a disruptor on the project. So constantly to be a disruptor, to make us think creatively, and just to kind of, for all of us to shift how we thought about things. And that art exhibition that I showed, the pieces that we created were created, it wasn't an end of project thing, they were created throughout the project. So throughout the project we were thinking in this way. And Simon, after that really difficult start where I completely had misunderstood, Simon at all of the meetings would be really vocal and would push us to think about things in different ways all the time. So it wasn't at all about producing a piece of art. It was about shifting our thought processes into a really different space. And I think that was enabled. How did we do that? I think we did that by being really respectful to Simon in the meetings. So Simon was very vocal and very present in the meetings, and was given a lot of space and respect and we all really enjoyed the interactions that we had with him. So that was how we that's how we managed that, and it was brilliant having him involved. But I completely got it wrong. I thought that he was there to draw pictures. So bad. But we learn, and that's why I'm sharing it with you.
We appreciate you sharing it.
Yes, always.
So we have a question from Gonzalo, who says the multidisciplinary process is for sure time consuming, and in an environment where there is significant pressure to publish, especially I guess in their field of economics, where the revision process can take up to 2 years. What advice would you offer to sort of balance that?
I think you've got to think about when you need to work in that interdisciplinary way and when you don't. So I think that not every journal article you produce needs to be interdisciplinary. I think that it's good sometimes to do a really solid single discipline journal article. I think that's really important. And like I've said, I think what you need is your research projects to factor in the time for the interdisciplinary working. You can't just think that you'll get the same amount done in the same time. So when you're either developing your research proposal or working out your research plan going forward, factoring in the fact that everything is going to take longer is really, really key. But you don't have to always be interdisciplinary in everything. It's important to be strategic when you decide you want to bring in those different disciplines. So think really, really hard. And I think this is something also that is a mistake people make. They think, it has to be interdisciplinary. But it's worth sitting down and thinking about, what does my publication look like? Do I actually need this piece of work to involve different disciplines? And if so, which one should it involve? And the answer to that can be no. And if it's going to be yes, then you have to factor in that extra time. But be strategic. Think, do I really need to be interdisciplinary? And then if you do, then you'll come out with an even better publication at the end of it.
Yeah, thanks for that. So we have a question from Oliver, who says, do you think that the future of what a scientist looks like will have to be someone that is already in transdisciplinarity?
I really hope not. Absolutely not. That would be really terrible. I think that we need some people who are 100% one discipline, like completely there, like just focusing on their one single area. That is so important. But then we also need people who can work in that interdisciplinary way. We need a mix is what we need. And that's what worries me a little bit, like I say, about what we're seeing at the moment, because so many research proposals and like the PhD proposals that are coming out are everything has to be interdisciplinary. And I think almost we're going too far that way sometimes now. So no, let's keep those single discipline people. They're brilliant. We need them too.
Great. I'm sure that's reassuring for some people. So there's two questions which are both about the principles that you presented. So I'm going to kind of combine them. So one was sort of, how do you integrate the principles into actually planning your project? Is there a clear way to, I don't know, have a set discussion at the beginning? And also, how do they sort of link? How do the principles link to the vocabularies and the variety of methods? And how does all that cross together?
I mean, I tend to try and sit down when I'm writing a proposal at the beginning or starting a project and work through them and make sure that they're all addressed. So in those top tips, when you're designing your project, like I've said, factor in time, perhaps look for an early output to be a shared publication, sort of go through them and make sure that when you're working that you're going to address each one of those principles. It makes a really big difference. And there's lots of tips in there about how you can go about that. What was the second part of the question?
It was more linked to how different vocabularies and different methods within, I guess, the separate disciplines kind of link to those principles.
So the principles were developed in a really interdisciplinary way. So these principles were developed with an awful lot of different, I think 170 people were involved, so there's a lot of different disciplines involved as well, including a lot of non-academics. So I would hope that the terms that we've used in there are acceptable and understandable across disciplines. With regard to that, understanding each other's vocabularies, one of the things in the communication was to start early on with a glossary or a dictionary or some kind of document where you list the terms, and notice when you're having meetings if there's terms that you're stumbling on and make a note of them and try and come back to them.
Yeah, perfect. So you were talking a bit about engaging non-academic, I don't know if we call them stakeholders, or people who are going to engage in the project who aren't in academia. And I was wondering, I mean, I guess they're not necessarily used to working in the standard project approaches that academics are. I mean, does that also bring challenges? And actually, do we need to maybe make our projects more flexible or adaptable in terms of, not everyone will be familiar with the standard processes. Some things might need to be more flexible in terms of milestones and deadlines to accommodate this type of working. Do we need to look more into that?
Yeah, I think so, but I think they're not so different always as some of the other disciplines as well. I think different disciplines work surprisingly differently. So, for example, going back to Simon, the artist that I worked with on the project a few years ago, when we were writing the proposal, I said to him, Simon, I need you to write down what you're going to do. And what happens in, for example, ecology, is that you write down, I will use this method at these case study sites, and this will be the outputs, and it's all very laid out. And I mean, in reality, that might not happen, but you write that at the proposal stage. Whereas Simon was like, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know how it's going to look. We're going to use creative approaches, but I can't tell you what the outputs are because I don't know yet. And I don't know. So, and I think it's the same with stakeholders or non-academics or research users. I think it's the same for them. I think we all need to be quite careful with each other about how we write proposals and how we develop them. And I think on those little circles on the diagram that I showed, that's why I think about the non-academics or users as just another one of those circles. And I don't think they're so different, really. The thing that's important is that you co-develop the project together so that you understand and you listen to them and what their needs are and what their expectations are, and make sure that you're all on the same page. This is the problem, is even writing the proposal takes longer because you've got different people with different expectations. But if you take the time at the proposal stage to co-develop it, it makes it a lot easier later on, I think, really. So yeah, I mean, you definitely do need different approaches. For example, if you've got a project with ecologists and non-academics than you would with just ecologists, but you need different approaches if you've got ecologists and economists and you just had ecologists. So yeah, all these disciplines, really fascinating, all come with their own nuances and needs and expectations, and it's just about really taking time and listening, I think.
Yeah, and that kind of links to a question that Britt has asked in the chat, because she doesn't have access to the Q&A. But she says there's also increasing interest in integrating with Indigenous and local knowledge to link with scientific knowledge. Do you have any additional tips for facilitating those type of collaborations? Do you have experience?
Yeah, I had a really nice experience recently, actually. So we were doing some in-depth work on an estuary site in northern Scotland, and we were struggling we wanted to map the estuary. So we wanted to understand the habitats of there and who was using what and the ecosystem services from that area. And it was really hard to find the data. But we found what data we could, and we produced some maps that said seagrasses are here and salt marshes are there. so we had that work going, use sort of standard approaches to mapping. And then at the same time, what we did is we had some really in-depth community-based workshops where we took a map of the space, just with the space, and we got the local community who are considered indigenous communities, because a lot of people there lived there for centuries, never lived anywhere else. So that there's that really in-depth, long-term knowledge. And we asked them to fill in, where are the seagrasses, where are the salt marshes, what benefits do you get, where are the fisheries? So we ended up with this really interesting 2 sets of maps where it was like, oh, okay. So like this one is like quite different from this one. And you can really see from the one that's produced by the community, like where people are actually going and how people are using it and what people value. And we did that over 4 workshops. Each workshop was a day, and we spent a lot of time and energy and effort on the second part, and it was incredibly valuable. And it's been great because that group, the community group, have been much more engaged now in the project, and we're looking at restoration of coastal sites there, and they're really interested now and want to know what's happening, and it's been really, really positive. So I think using or actually that's not the great word to say actually, but working with indigenous communities to understand the knowledge that they hold and actually empower them to bring that knowledge to the table and make sure that knowledge is included in our decision making is 100% where we need to be going in the future. And it's hard, and you have to really work on those relationships, but yeah, my experience of it has been so positive. Yeah, it's been really, really good.
Yeah, indeed. And linked to that, I mean, in some work we did a few years ago, there was a recommendation. I mean, it was linked to ocean governance, so it's kind of related. And there was a recommendation that actually there should be funding available for the process to put together the project proposal, to make sure that, you know, other groups are included. And you were talking about relationships, and is there also a need to sort of extend the project funding beyond the project to maintain those relationships? You know, do we need to spread the funding wider than just the 3 or 4 years that it normally covers?
A good point, because I think what's really hard, like with that example that I just gave you, is the project will now run for 6 more months, and those communities have been really, it's been really great hearing their voices and sharing their voices. But when we finish, our involvement will stop, but the restoration activities and the port development that's happening up there will continue. Now, how do we make sure that their voices continue to be heard when we're no longer involved? So I think that issue of continuity of funding, and like you're saying as well, when you're developing the project, like having funding to actually bring those voices in is really important as well, because you don't want to just drop them in once you've got the funding. They need to be involved at the but then you don't know who they are until you're actually starting working. It's really tricky. No, Paula, I think that's really valid, that to have funding either side would be incredibly helpful. Yeah, because it's hard, I think, for those communities, picked up by a project, used for 3 years, ditched. Not ideal.
And then picked up by the next project with slightly different group, ditched again.
Slightly different goals. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's been absolutely fascinating. I'm really sad we're running out of time, because I definitely could have kept going for much longer. But I'm just going to share my final slide. And as I'm doing that, Nicola, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your thoughts, and answering all our questions. I think this has been a really useful session, and I'm really glad that we were able to have this discussion. And just a final advert. So our next Third Thursday Science webinar will be on the 16th of May, and it will feature 2 of our outgoing artists in residence, so Sonia Levy and the Studio Thinking Hand, and they will talk about the work they've done as our artists in residence over the past year. So I think that's going to be a really interesting discussion. I look forward to seeing you hopefully there. And yeah, thank you, Nicola, and everyone for attending, and see you all soon.
Time.